And here we are. Let's take another deep breath. Breathing in and letting go. Entering into this beautiful moment. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome, YouTube family. Today will be another beautiful sermon. We'll see what happens. I was having thoughts where I might change it up a little bit, but who knows where the winds will blow today. The first initial thought that came to mind was, well, first of all, this is week 3 of our life cleanse. We started at Midwinter and we're doing 7 weeks leading up to the spring equinox, the first day of spring. And so each week we're just kind of taking notes of different areas of our life. The first one was mental, the second one was more of our impulsive nature, and then this one is regarding our emotions, our watchers. And I always like to think of emotional harmony whenever it comes to mastery of emotion. And I think I was telling Andrew this the other day, but there are still plenty of times where I may not necessarily feel completely at inner peace within my mind. But these past few years, it's interesting. I've noticed that peace has pretty much remained in my body. While years past, holy cow, I would have chronic anxiety in my gut, or that tension. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Anytime you feel stress or anxiety, it's just like there's a knot there forever. And what's fascinating is doing the work of living peace and going through the tenets and then applying it to our marriage and just literally applying it to every area of our life. Granted, it took me years to get to that because I started this journey about 10 years ago. But I'd say the past 3 years, the physical aspect of peace has existed, whereas my mind still sometimes like to jump from thing to thing to thing. It doesn't transfer into my body anymore. And I just thought, wow, that's pretty cool to think about, to slow down and say, okay, what has been working, what hasn't been working, and the physical component definitely has. And so I share this to give hope. Because I know I remember that gut feeling and how it even disrupts digestion at times. It impacts all areas of our life, and it's a chronic feeling of unwellness. Even if we look calm on the outside. And so we're going to talk a little bit about thingamajigs today that's going to harken back to that. And so let's go ahead and take a deep breath. I actually think I'm going to start with excerpts from my book, Living Peace. And for those of you who have it, we're actually going to be going in the initial story that starts off mastery of emotion. And I've condensed it a little bit. I'm about halfway through it. But the beginning stages, I talk about my first love experience and how it effed me up. But let me correct that. I allowed to have it F me up. I chose to give in to my impulses. I chose to give in to my neurosis. I chose to react more emotionally. And the first part of it that I'm not reading today talks about the actual relationship, and then this is when I start to shift it. I had no control over my emotional state of being, and that was when I decided enough was enough. It was time for me to let my old love go, release all illusions, and stop reliving the past and or living in hopes of a future with him. Neither existed in the here and now, and I had already wasted a few years of my life suffering for no reason other than my own inability to let things go. Let me repeat that. I had already wasted a few years of my life suffering for no reason other than my inability to let things go. I had once again given my power away, and it was time to reclaim it. I vowed never again to give my power away to another person by making my happiness dependent upon them. It was time to take responsibility for my own happiness. Deep breath. And I wrote some notes after that before I jump into the next segment. Giving our power away is like putting our happiness in a little box. Write that down. Giving our power away to someone else, to some other entity, is like putting our happiness in a little box. it's like we're condensing the totality of our experience and our life in this one area and just shoving it down. But what's fascinating is I also thought of the analogy of a genie. To where who's ever seen like fantasy or Aladdin or anything like that, where genies make wishes, right? And so here you have the totality of experience in this little bottle that can grant any wish. But what happens to most people who make wishes with genies based off of stories that we hear? Does it normally work out in people's favor? No. If anyone who likes Once Upon a Time, magic always comes with a price. But think about that. We are condensing down our happiness into a little box and almost treating it like a genie, saying, if I get this wish, if my wish comes true and whatever's in this box sorts itself out, maybe it's job related, maybe it's work related, maybe it's relationship related, maybe it could be anything. But generally we do have something that we attach our happiness to. It's very limited in a confined space, and we're hoping that something would be different. But even, here's my illusion breaking. Even if that thing worked out and you got your wish, it's not going to lead to that happily ever ending that the genie promised. Because eventually something else is going to come along that's going to shake your life up. And then after that, something else is going to come along that's going to shake your life up. And there's really no such thing as that happily ever after in that sense. But the happily ever after is possible, but it has to come from a place of peace. You have to build that foundation of peace underneath it, not placing all of our happiness in some box, in some idea, in some relationship, in some work-related achievement, etc. So let's breathe that in for a moment. What I love about Zen Buddhism is a lot of Zen monks, they say, or some of them say, we can cultivate joy in beautiful weather. It's really easy to cultivate the positive attributes to life when the weather is fair. But that's not real practice. Real practice is being able to cultivate peace, joy, wellness, harmony when the weather is rough. And being able to smile when there's suffering, not just smiling when we're already having a beautiful day. And so what is that quote that I love by Thich Nhat Hanh? It goes something along the lines of, something along the lines of, we smile when there's suffering because we recognize that we're more than our suffering. We smile even when there's sorrow around us because we recognize that we're more than our sorrow. And so that's just a beautiful reminder in that normally when we start to suffer emotionally, we're putting our mind in a little box and we're pretending that that box is the totality of our experience, and we're making wishes for this thing to be different. But as we know from the wisdom of genies, that even if you get your wish, it doesn't actually lead to necessarily a lasting happiness. It might be a temporary happiness, but not the lasting happiness that starts with the foundation of inner peace below it. I'll continue reading from Living Peace. The person I am today, a decade later, would have responded to my first love experience with pure acceptance. Because of our conflicting life paths, we had many conflicts in our budding relationship. Instead of being fully supportive, I allowed my attachment to him and my feelings of desire to cloud my peace and kindness. What I thought was love was actually behaviors and mentality of ego on my part. Although love was present at the core, genuine love would not have eroded into the self-destructive behavior I displayed. This is why the teaching of unattachment is so critical. Had I been in my peace, I would have still ended the relationship since it was the most rational choice, given that we were so young and on very different life paths. However, I would have done so from genuine place of love, which would have shown itself as unconditional happiness for him and unconditional peace for me. The result? No karmic patterns of grief, living in the past, or participating in numerous unhealthy relationships in the future. And so this kind of harkens back to last week's sermon where I said, whenever we react impulsively and from ego, we are actually reinforcing our suffering. We're reinforcing patterns. And so because I was like, so young at the time, I did not know how to control my emotions yet. And what ended up happening is that I handled things very poorly. And that created almost a karmic pattern of where I started jumping from dating this person to this person to this person, trying to fill that void in myself. While what was fascinating is before I met him, I was like I was always, what's the word I'm looking for? I was one of those people that was so hard to date because I always kept my energy right here and my happiness right here. But then when I got a taste of what it was like to have romance and to have intimacy and to have that kind of connection, then all of a sudden I started chasing it. And my mind just went out the window. And it caused me so much suffering because I started, rather than before I met him, my happiness was self-created. Afterwards, I started placing my happiness in the hands of other men. And that caused a lot of turmoil in my life. And so we're going to be talking about some nature themes today. So tending to the soil, sunlight, and water is equivalent to tending to our body, our awareness, and our emotions. The soil is our body, the awareness is the sunlight, and then the water is our emotions, are our emotions. And so I wasn't allowing myself to bloom anymore. How could I bloom if I was getting nutrients from other people and they really can't give me their nutrients? It's hollow nutrition when we're trying to plug into our roots into other people, when what we need to be doing is plugging our roots into the earth, into ourselves. And so instead of taking care of my body, I was just filling it with pleasure. Instead of taking care of my awareness, I was all over the fucking place. I was in the past, I was in the future, anywhere but the now. And then instead of taking care of my emotions in the water, I was, what's a great analogy I can use? Well, we could just say the water was never still. It was always rushing. It was always turbulent. So it was never still for me to actually see my reflection. And so let's jump to our handout real quick, which again I'll put in our Dunisha online group. So we'll fill this in. For our hearts to be pollinated by the world, we must allow the flower within our heart and minds to bloom. For our hearts to be pollinated by the world, we must allow the flower within our heart and mind to bloom. Here I thought I was open, but what was interesting is that it was almost like a false opening. Because in my openness, I was codependent, I was neurotic. And so when I would unveil this beautiful flower, this blooming experience, it wasn't necessarily beautiful. It was ripe with, I want to say dis-ease. Well, think about that, dis-ease, write that word down, dis-ease. And then the scent of the beautiful flower would repel people. Because again, my nutrients weren't coming from a so-called, quote, positive source. They were coming through non-nutritional sources, and it wasn't able to support that my healthy soil, my healthy waters, the healthy sunlight that would then allow me to bloom. So then let's fill in the blank underneath that. Blooming is a personal choice of activating our openness. Blooming is a personal choice of activating our openness. And finally, soil, sunlight, and water, our body awareness, and our emotions. The process of blooming are our daily actions. So it was an irony to where I felt so much more open to the world, while before I was more reserved. But that was the paradox that I had to learn to shift to, where I came back to being more reserved, just like how I am today, not giving my energy to just anywhere, in any place, and anyone. I brought that structure back into my life so that I can actually take care of myself, and in the taking care of myself, the blooming started to occur once more. And so we have the soil, we have our body. How do I take care of my body? We have the sunlight that represents awareness. How do I take care of my mind? And we have the water that represents emotion. How do I take care of my emotional equilibrium? So let's breathe that in. Continuing reading. Peace becomes possible when we cease to let our emotions be swayed by the conditions in the outside world. When we are not autopilot and unaware of our ability to take control, life is a roller coaster of emotion. Up, down, left, right, all around, depending on the rails of external conditions. The so-called negative situation in our lives causes us to feel depressed, angry, and stressed. And to counteract them, we often wait for happy occurrences to shift our moods, or we chase happiness, planning ahead for our joy or relief. The game we play when we give our emotional power away to other things or people is a dangerous one. The goal is to be at peace here in the now, not waiting for all tracks in our life to line up just right before we can feel at peace, be happy. Peace is not something to chase, it is something to be. Our mission is to embody and become peace. Let's take a breath. So that's going back to placing our happiness in a little box. I was, after my first love experience, I was putting all my mind, all my energy in this little box, forgetting the totality of experience, forgetting the spaciousness of this life. And falling into codependency, what ended up happening is I was waiting on the world to prove itself to me. I was waiting on other people to prove themselves to me. Slowly but surely, even though I was sharing myself with people more than ever before, my heart was hardening. Isn't that interesting? I love polarities like that. I was so, quote, open, but my heart was hardening. While before, I was more reserved, but my heart was open. Isn't that interesting? And so, what's fascinating, it was like I was a flower waiting to be pollinated by the bees, to experience love and gentleness, but without ever actually opening my heart space. But it doesn't work that way, does it? If a flower's like this, in the heart, my body may have been like this, but my heart was like that, right? Can bees actually pollinate it? They can't get in. And so what's fascinating is that in this practice, we end up learning to no matter our body, wherever it's at, we recognize that this is where the energy must go. And so I slowly returned, and I stopped expecting love from people. I stopped expecting people to behave a certain way to make me happy. I just dropped all gosh darn expectations. And I wrote here, it's like, if people didn't return my kindness, it didn't hurt me. Think about that. How many times have you been kind to someone and then they didn't return it and you're like, fuck them. It's the last time I'm kind to them. You know, it hurts, but what it hurts is the ego. It hurts because we had an expectation. We wanted things to look differently. Maybe there's a little box there that we're placing some wishes in that aren't benefiting us. But if we choose to be kind, we choose to be loving, we choose to be gentle, we choose to be peaceful, even if we're not receiving any of those things, it's not actually hurting us. Really, it's not benefiting the other person more. But when we learn to live our life in the way of not having those expectations, we're actually able to keep our heart open without needing the world to prove itself to us. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to keep ourselves in abusive situations and just keep giving our love into an endless void. That's not what this is talking about. That, there's a whole other talks I give on healthy boundaries. This is more talking about just how are you creating spaciousness in your heart on a daily basis. No matter where you're at, what relationships you're in, it's not about that right now. It's about where is your peace. And peace really does arise from the opening of the spaciousness of the blooming of the heart. How poetic. And so, starting to love without expectation, starting to return to my own root system with the soil, the sunlight of awareness, the waters of my emotions. I started to feel well again. And by feeling well, I stopped falling for bullshit. Because normally when we fall for bullshit, it's because we're in our own delusions, that which I talked a lot about last week, of the removing self-deceptions from our life. And when we see our old temptations, we see them clearly for what they are, and we recognize that it's not a lasting happiness. It might be pleasurable at first, but it's not actually going to lead to a solid life. And so it's much easier to return into our own space, into our own home, into our own heart. And then when we go back out into the world, we're able to show up with grace, with dignity, with openness, and we don't fall for the bullshit, and the bullshit doesn't hurt us anymore. Because we're strong and we're able to bloom, because we're getting our nutrients from here rather than here. Interesting, isn't it? So let's breathe that in. So down below, one more fill in the blank is practice of cultivating spaciousness. The practice of cultivating spaciousness, the last fill in the blank there. I love that word. The last couple of weeks we're talking about the practice of inviting freshness, and here I'm adding in the practice of cultivating spaciousness. And think about it, it's the healing aspect of when we're putting our ideas, our hopes, our desires, our happiness, our peace in a little box. There's not a lot of space in that little box. And so bringing things out, giving everything space, it allows things to heal. Kind of goes back to a little bit the quote of, we cannot heal what we do not acknowledge. We can't heal what we don't acknowledge. And when things are compact little box, generally we're not seeing and acknowledging everything. And before we conclude today's talk, we'll go back to just the reminder that it's our opportunity, it's our, I don't want to say mission, because then it's not about having disappointment if you don't reach it, but we strive to learn to bloom in any climate. So just remember, when things are going great, awesome. Happiness is easy. When things aren't going great, that's okay too. But that's the most beautiful time to practice the teachings in living peace, and whatever teachings speak to your heart that improve, that you find benefit in. But please remember, it is possible to bloom in any climate. And recognizing that peace is the foundation, it's the fertilizer. That is what will allow us to. So let's take a deep breath in. And release. Well, I want to thank our YouTube family for joining us today on our Life Cleanse Week 3. I'm gonna post this in our Facebook group, but I'll go ahead and just share this real quick, our journaling prompts that follow. What have you been waiting for from, quote, life or others until you let your heart open and bloom? So after listening to this sermon, maybe take some time to journal this. What have you been waiting for from life or from other people until you've let your heart open up, until you let your heart open and bloom? I think that's a beautiful thought to conclude on and to reflect upon, because a lot of times we're waiting for certain conditions, external conditions to be met before we allow our heart to fully open and bloom. But actually, it's the blooming that comes first, and then it influences our external conditions. Taking a deep breath in and releasing. And as always, links are down below if anyone would like to buy a copy of my book, Living Peace, or offer some generous donations. Any amount helps us, and we appreciate them dearly. Thank you. Blessed be.